He was born into a world where inequality was not hidden, it was normal. From his earliest days, he could see the difference between what was promised and what was practiced. Laws spoke of freedom, but streets told another story. Opportunities were uneven, respect was conditional, and dignity was often denied. For many, this kind of beginning becomes a lifelong wound. It becomes anger. It becomes bitterness. It becomes a reason to give up or strike back. But for him, it became something else entirely. As a child, he asked questions that had no easy answers. Why were some doors always open while others were locked? Why were some voices heard while others were ignored? Why did worth seem to depend on appearance rather than character? These questions could have filled his heart with resentment, but instead, they awakened his awareness. He did not ignore the pain around him. He studied it. He did not deny injustice. He confronted it with understanding. Even at a young age, he sensed that reacting with hatred would only multiply the problem. Growing up in an environment shaped by discrimination forces a choice on the soul. One path leads to rage, the other to responsibility. Many around him believed survival meant hardening the heart, but he believed survival meant strengthening the spirit. He learned that bitterness may feel powerful in the moment, but it weakens vision. It narrows the future. Purpose, on the other hand, expands it. Purpose gives pain a direction instead of letting it rot inside. He saw people broken not only by chains, but by hopelessness. He realized that injustice does not only wound the body, it slowly convinces the mind that change is impossible. That realization shaped his mission. He understood that if people could be made to believe they were less, they would eventually live less. So before changing laws or systems, something deeper had to change belief, and belief begins with purpose. Rather than allowing anger to control his life, he disciplined it. He transformed frustration into fuel. Every unfair moment became a reminder of what needed to be fixed, not who needed to be hated. This was not weakness, it was strength under control. It takes far more courage to refuse bitterness than to embrace it. Anyone can hate back. Few can rise above and still stand firm. Purpose gave him clarity. It helped him see that injustice was not personal alone. It was structural, historical, and learned. And if it was learned, it could be unlearned. That understanding protected his heart from poisoning itself with resentment. He did not excuse wrongdoing, but he refused to let it define his humanity. He believed that responding with dignity was itself an act of resistance. There were moments when bitterness tempted him, moments when the weight of inequality pressed hard, when progress felt slow, when the cost of standing up felt too high. But each time he returned to his purpose, he reminded himself that the goal was not to defeat people, but to defeat injustice, not to replace one form of dominance with another, but to build a future where dominance was no longer needed. His purpose was shaped by the belief that every human being carries value, even when they fail to see it in others. That belief did not come from comfort. It was forged in hardship. It was easier to hate those who benefited from injustice. It was harder to believe they could change, yet he chose the harder path because he understood that lasting change requires moral courage, not just emotional reaction. By choosing purpose over bitterness, he set an example that quietly challenged the world. He showed that suffering does not have to make you smaller, it can make you wiser. He proved that being born into injustice does not mean you are destined to repeat it. A person can acknowledge pain without becoming its prisoner. His life reminds us that our beginnings do not decide our endings. Circumstances may shape our experiences, but they do not have to shape our character. Bitterness says, this is what was done to me. Purpose says, this is what I will do about it. One looks backward in anger, the other looks forward in hope. In choosing purpose, he reclaimed control over his story. He refused to let injustice write his identity. Instead, he used it to clarify his mission. And that decision, made again and again, became the foundation of everything that followed. This is the first lesson his life offers. You cannot always choose the world you are born into, but you can choose what kind of soul you become. And when you choose purpose over bitterness, even the darkest beginnings can lead to a future filled with meaning, strength, and change. He believed that knowledge could break chains that force never could. While others saw education as a privilege, he saw it as a responsibility. To him, learning was not about personal success alone. It was about preparation for service. He understood that ignorance keeps injustice alive while understanding exposes it. Every book he read, every idea he explored, sharpened his vision of a fairer world. He did not seek education to escape his reality, but to transform it. Faith played an equally powerful role in shaping his strength. Not faith as blind belief, but faith as moral clarity. It gave him a compass when the road ahead was uncertain. It reminded him that justice was not just a political goal, but a moral obligation. When circumstances were cruel and progress felt invisible, faith kept him grounded. It whispered that truth that does not lose its power simply because it is resisted. It assured him that standing for what is right always matters, even when the outcome is unclear. Courage, however, was what brought education and faith into action. Knowledge without courage stays silent. Faith without courage remains passive. He understood that courage is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear decide. Every time he spoke out, he risked criticism, rejection, and danger. Every time he stepped forward, he knew there would be consequences, yet he stepped forward anyway, because silence felt more dangerous than opposition. He rejected hatred as a tool, not because he underestimated its force, but because he understood its cost. Hatred consumes the one who carries it. It narrows vision and hardens the heart. He believed that responding to hate with hate only deepened the wounds of society. Violence in his eyes was a confession of failure, the failure to persuade, to understand, to elevate. He chose a higher standard, even when the world mocked it as weakness. There were voices that told him love was unrealistic, that compassion could not defeat cruelty. But he saw something others miss. Hate may intimidate, but it cannot inspire. Fear may control, but it cannot heal. Only love has the power to transform enemies into neighbors. Only moral strength can create lasting change. He believed that when people are confronted with dignity, they are forced to confront their own conscience. Education gave him the words, faith gave him the values, and courage gave him the action. Together, they formed a force stronger than hatred. This combination allowed him to challenge injustice without becoming unjust himself. He refused to mirror the cruelty he opposed. Instead, he exposed it by standing in contrast to it. There were times when restraint was mistaken for weakness, when patience was labeled as surrender. But he understood that true strength is discipline. It is easy to destroy. It is difficult to build. It is easy to react. It is hard to respond with intention. His courage was not loud or reckless. It was steady, deliberate, and grounded in principle. By choosing wisdom over rage, he showed that power does not always roar. Sometimes it speaks calmly and still changes history. He proved that a clear mind is more dangerous to injustice than clenched fists. His approach forced the world to look at itself, to see the contradiction between its values and its actions. He believed that when people are educated, they can no longer be easily manipulated. When they are guided by faith, they are harder to corrupt. And when they act with courage, they become impossible to ignore. This belief shaped every step he took. It allowed him to stand unbroken in the face of hostility and hopeful in the face of delay. His life teaches that hatred is loud but empty, while wisdom is quiet but enduring. Education builds understanding, faith builds character, and courage builds change. Alone, each has limits. Together, they become unstoppable. This is the second lesson his life offers. You do not defeat darkness by becoming darker. You defeat it by becoming wiser, stronger, and more grounded in truth. When education sharpens the mind, faith steadies the heart, and courage moves the soul, even the deepest hatred begins to lose its grip. He understood early on that violence may force attention, but it never wins understanding. It can shake buildings, but it cannot rebuild society. It can silence voices, but it cannot change hearts. Many believe that injustice could only be crushed with equal force, yet he saw a deeper truth. Systems of oppression are sustained not just by power, but by mindset. And unless that mindset is transformed, injustice simply changes its shape. He believed real change begins where laws cannot reach, inside the human heart and mind. You can pass new rules, but if people's thinking remains unchanged, those rules become empty words. Hatred will find new paths. Discrimination will wear new disguises. That is why he focused on awakening conscience rather than provoking chaos. He knew that lasting change must be understood, not just enforced. Violence creates winners and losers. Transformation creates partners. He did not want a society where one group replaced another at the top. He wanted a society where the idea of top no longer mattered. His vision was not about reversing roles, but about redefining values. That required conversation, courage, and clarity, not destruction. He saw that anger is powerful but short-lived. It burns fast and then leaves ashes. Minds shaped by anger close themselves off. Hearts ruled by rage stop listening. But when people are challenged with truth spoken calmly and firmly, they are forced to think. And thinking is dangerous to injustice. Once someone begins to question what they have always accepted, change has already begun. He believed nonviolence was not passive, it was strategic. It exposed cruelty without copying it. When injustice is met with dignity, the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. The world is forced to see who's truly causing harm. In that moment, silence becomes uncomfortable, neutrality becomes impossible, and conscience is awakened. Changing hearts was slower than breaking windows, but it was stronger. He accepted that progress would be painful and patience would be tested, yet he trusted that moral pressure applied consistently could bend even the hardest systems. He believed that people are not born hating, they are taught, and what is taught can be untaught. He spoke to the humanity of those who opposed him, even when they denied his. This was not because he was Nabi, but because he understood psychology. People rarely change when they feel attacked. They change when they are confronted with their own contradiction. By appealing to shared values, justice, fairness, dignity, he held up a mirror to society and asked it to look honestly at itself. There were critics who called this approach too soft, too slow, too idealistic. But he knew that moral change always looks weak to those who worship force. He understood that the loudest method is not always the most effective. History is full of revolutions that replace one injustice with another. He wanted something different, something deeper. He believed that when minds are educated and hearts are stirred, laws eventually follow. But when laws come first without moral readiness, they are resisted, ignored, or reversed. That is why he invested his energy in people, in speeches that challenged thinking, in actions that modeled integrity, in sacrifices that made injustice visible. He accepted suffering not as a goal, but as a consequence of standing for truth. And even in suffering, he refused to dehumanize others. This choice stripped injustice of its moral excuse. It revealed oppression for what it truly was, fear of equality. His approach demanded discipline. It required controlling anger, choosing words carefully, and refusing to give in to provocation. This was not easy. It required strength greater than violence, the strength to remain human in an inhumane system. That strength inspired others. It spread not through fear, but through example. By focusing on hearts and minds, he built a movement that outlived moments. He created ideas that could not be arrested. He planted values that could not be silenced. Even those who disagreed with him were forced to engage with his message. And once engaged, they could not unsee the truth. His life teaches us that justice is not only a legal battle, it is a moral one. Systems fall when belief shifts. Power collapses when legitimacy disappears. And legitimacy disappears when people stop believing lies they once accepted as normal. This is the third lesson his life offers. If you want to change the world, do not start by destroying it. Start by awakening it. Change minds, and behavior will follow. Change hearts, and history will move. Violence may break chains, but only understanding breaks cycles. He stood in the face of fear without pretending it didn't exist. Fear was real. Threats were real. The danger was constant. Yet he refused to let fear become his master. He understood something most people never fully grasp. Fear is a signal, not a command. It warns you of risk. But it does not get to decide your purpose. Every time fear rose, he listened, then he moved forward anyway. Opposition surrounded him from every direction. Some attacked his ideas, others attacked his character, many attacked his safety. There were moments when stepping back would have been understandable, even wise by ordinary standards. But he knew that retreat would not only silence his voice, it would strengthen injustice. He believed that courage is not about bold gestures, but about daily commitment, showing up again and again, even when the cost keeps rising. Exhaustion became a constant companion. Carrying the hopes of millions is a heavy burden. Progress was slow, resistance was fierce, And criticism came from both enemies and allies. There were nights filled with doubt, mornings heavy with responsibility. Yet he did not confuse tiredness with defeat. He allowed himself to feel the weight, but he did not allow it to bend his spine. He understood that standing firm does not mean standing alone. He drew strength from community, from shared struggle, from the knowledge that the cause was larger than any single life. When fear whispered that he was replaceable, purpose reminded him that leadership is not about being irreplaceable. It is about being faithful to the moment you are given. Threats were meant to silence him, but they clarified his mission. When danger increased, so did his resolve. He did not seek martyrdom, but he accepted risk as the price of truth. He believed that a life protected by silence is more dangerous than a life exposed by honesty. Safety without integrity felt like a slow surrender. Standing firm required discipline. It meant choosing patience when anger was justified, choosing calm when chaos would have been easier, choosing words carefully when shouting might have felt more satisfying. This discipline became his shield. It prevented opponents from distracting him from the mission or pulling him into reactions that would weaken the message. He was often told to wait, to slow down, to be realistic, to compromise timing for comfort. But he understood that wait is often the most polite form of denial. He had seen how delay quietly kills hope. So he refused to pause his conscience to protect others' convenience. Standing firm sometimes meant standing uncomfortable. Fear tried to isolate him, but he refused isolation. He spoke openly about danger, not to dramatize it, but to normalize courage. By acknowledging fear, he gave others permission to be brave without pretending to be fearless. His honesty made courage feel accessible, not heroic. He knew that stepping back would send a message louder than any speech. It would tell the oppressed that their pain was negotiable. It would tell the powerful that pressure works. He could not accept that, so he stayed. He marched. He spoke. He endured. Not because he was fearless, but because he believed some things are worth fear. Even when progress felt invisible, he trusted the process. He believed that standing firm plants seeds you may never see grow. That consistency matters more than speed. That history remembers those who remained steady, not those who were comfortable. His firmness was not rigid, it was grounded. He listened, reflected, adjusted tactics, but never abandoned principles. That balance allowed him to remain human under inhuman pressure. He did not become hardened by opposition. He became clearer. This is the fourth lesson his life offers. Courage is not a moment, it is a posture. Standing firm does not mean never feeling fear or fatigue. It means refusing to let them decide who you become. When you stand your ground with integrity, even the strongest storms eventually reveal the strength of your foundation. And in that firmness, fear loses its power, not because it disappears, but because it is no longer in control. He did not become a leader by shouting over others, but by speaking for those who had been ignored for generations. He listened before he spoke. He carried the pain, frustration, and hopes of people who had been denied platforms, protection, and respect. Their silence was not a lack of voice. It was the result of being unheard. He chose to change that, not by anger, but by truth. Truth was his language. Not exaggerated, not manipulated, not poisoned with hatred. He understood that anger can attract attention, but it often pushes people into defense. Truth, when spoken with clarity and dignity, does something different. It disarms, it forces reflection, it unsettles comfort without destroying dialogue. He believed that truth spoken calmly is more threatening to injustice than rage ever could be. He became a voice for the voiceless, not by speaking louder, but by speaking cleaner. Every word was chosen with care because he knew words carry consequences. He refused to lie to inspire, even when lies would have been easier. He refused to insult to energize, even when insults would have drawn cheers. His power came from credibility. People trusted him because he did not manipulate their emotions. He respected their intelligence. He understood that speaking truth meant challenging both sides. He confronted injustice directly, but he also challenged his own supporters when they drifted toward hatred or despair. He believed leadership is not telling people what they want to hear, but what they need to hear. Sometimes that meant disappointment. Sometimes it meant criticism. But he accepted that responsibility. His message gave dignity back to those who had been stripped of it. When people heard him speak, they did not just feel anger, they felt seen. They felt named, their suffering was acknowledged, not dismissed or minimized. He validated pain without weaponizing it. That balance gave people strength instead of fury. He refused to dehumanize those who opposed him, even when they dehumanized him. This was one of his most radical choices. He believed that once you strip others of their humanity, you begin to lose your own. His truth did not need enemies. It needed accountability. By refusing to hate, he kept the moral high ground, and that position made his voice impossible to ignore. There were moments when anger would have been justified, moments when silence would have been safer. But he understood that silence in the face of injustice is not neutrality, it is endorsement. So he spoke, not to provoke, but to awaken, not to dominate, but to represent. He became a bridge between suffering and conscience. He gave language to emotions people could not yet articulate. He turned private pain into public awareness. In doing so, he removed shame from suffering. People realized they were not alone, not weak, not imagining injustice. That realization itself was empowering. His truth exposed systems without attacking souls. It made injustice visible without creating new divisions. That is why his voice traveled so far. It was not tied to one group or one moment. It spoke to universal values, fairness, dignity, equality. Even those who resisted his message had to argue with its substance, not dismiss it as noise. He showed that leadership is not about personal expression. It is about representation. He did not speak to be admired. He spoke to be effective. His ego never stood in front of the cause. His voice carried millions because it was never about him. This is the fifth lesson his life offers. Being a voice for the voiceless does not require rage. It requires truth. When truth is spoken with courage and compassion, it restores dignity, awakens conscience, and forces change. Anger may shout, but truth endures. He chose to speak about the future, not as a fantasy, but as a responsibility. Instead of focusing on revenge for past wrongs, he painted a vision of what could be. He understood that people move forward faster when they are pulled by hope than when they are pushed by anger. By speaking of dreams, he gave people something to walk toward, not just something to fight against. His vision was simple yet revolutionary. A world where worth is not measured by appearance, status, or background, but by character, where dignity is not reserved for a few, but guaranteed for all. He believed that equality was not about sameness, but about fairness. Everyone did not need to become identical. Everyone needed to become respected. By centering his message on character, he shifted the conversation from division to values. He challenged society to judge actions, not identities, intentions. Humanity, not hierarchy. This reframing forced people to examine their own biases. It made discrimination harder to defend because it stripped it of moral justification. He understood the power of dreaming publicly. Private hope is fragile. Shared hope becomes a movement. When people heard his words, they did not just imagine a better future. They began to believe they had a role in creating it. His dream did not belong to one group. It invited everyone in. That inclusiveness was its strength. He spoke of dignity as a birthright, not a reward. No one needed to earn their humanity. No one had to prove their value. This idea challenged systems built on exclusion and superiority. It reminded people that justice is not generosity, it is obligation. Freedom in his vision was not chaos or dominance. It was responsibility balanced with respect. A society where freedom rings only for some is not free at all. True freedom, he believed, must echo everywhere, or it is an illusion. This belief made his dream expansive, not selective. He knew that dreams alone are not enough. They must be anchored in action. But action without vision becomes blind struggle. His dream acted as a moral compass. It guided decisions, sacrifices, and strategies. It reminded people why the struggle mattered, especially when progress felt slow. Critics said dreaming was unrealistic. He understood that realism without imagination simply maintains injustice. Every system that exists today was once imagined by someone. If injustice can be built, justice can be built too. Dreams are not escapes, they are blueprints. By focusing on dignity and character, he removed fear from the equation. Fear thrives on difference. Dignity neutralizes it. When people are taught to see each other as human first, fear loses its grip. His dream worked not by erasing differences, but by elevating shared humanity above them. His message traveled across generations because it addressed something timeless. People everywhere want to be seen, respected, and valued. By framing justice as a moral ideal rather than a political demand, he made it universal. This is the sixth lesson his life offers. A powerful dream does not divide, it unites. When a vision is rooted in character, dignity, and equality, it becomes bigger than fear, stronger than hatred, and lasting beyond the moment. A dream like that does not fade. It calls each generation to carry it forward. He understood that a life driven by purpose does not end when the body does. Impact is not measured by how long someone lives, but by how deeply they change others. Even when his journey was cut short, his influence continued to move through time because it was never tied to his presence alone. It was tied to principles, and principles do not die. He invested in ideas rather than attention. Attention fades, ideas take root. He spoke in a way that invited people to think for themselves, to act on their own conscience, not to depend on him. That is why his absence did not create silence, it created responsibility. People realized that the work was never meant to stop with one voice, it was meant to multiply. His life proved that sacrifice is not lost when it serves a greater purpose. What he gave up in comfort, he returned in meaning. What he lost in safety, he gained in significance. His courage planted seeds he would never personally harvest, but he believed that was the highest form of leadership. True leaders build futures they may never see. Even attempts to erase him only strengthened his message. History has shown again and again that silencing a body does not silence truth. In fact, it often amplifies it. His words became reminders. His actions became standards. His dream became a measuring line against which injustice could no longer hide. He understood that movements survive when they are built on values, not personalities. Charisma fades, but conviction endures. By grounding his mission in universal principles, dignity, justice, equality, he ensured that his work could be carried forward by anyone, anywhere. No single person could own it, and no single act could end it. People who never met him still feel guided by him. Not because they follow a man, but because they recognize the truth he stood for. His life became proof that meaning outlives mortality. That when you align your actions with something greater than yourself, your influence stretches beyond time. He also showed that legacy is not something you chase. It is something you leave behind when you live honestly. He did not live to be remembered. He lived to be faithful to his purpose. Memory followed naturally. His integrity turned his life into a reference point for courage. His story reminds us that death does not define a life, decisions do. Every stand he took, every risk he accepted, every truth he spoke added weight to his legacy. And that weight continues to shift conversations, challenge systems, and inspire courage. The endurance of his impact places responsibility on those who come after. His life asks a quiet but demanding question. What will you do with the ground that has already been broken for you? Legacy is not meant to be admired from a distance. It is meant to be continued. This is the seventh lesson his life offers. When your life is anchored in purpose, it cannot be ended by time or force. The body may fall, but the mission stands. Impact, when rooted in truth, becomes immortal. He believed that every generation is tested by its moment. Not everyone is called to lead movements or speak to crowds, but everyone is called to choose. Neutrality, he understood, is not an innocent position when injustice is present. Silence does not pause harm, it allows it to continue. Each generation must decide whether it will inherit progress or surrender it. He knew that courage looks different in different times. For some, it is marching. For others, it is speaking when it is uncomfortable. For many, it is simply refusing to accept what has been labeled normal. He challenged people to see that history is shaped less by dramatic heroes and more by ordinary individuals who choose to act with integrity when it matters. Belief was central to his challenge, not belief as optimism, but belief as responsibility. To believe in justice means to participate in it. To believe in equality means to defend it. He warned through his life that ideals without action slowly turn into empty words. Every right that exists today survived because someone believed enough to protect it. He understood that progress is never permanent. Rights can be weakened. Freedoms can be reversed. Dignity can be negotiated away if people grow comfortable. That is why he urged constant awareness. Change must be maintained, not just achieved. Each generation must renew the commitment, or the ground already gained begins to erode. He rejected the idea that the dream belonged to one era. He believed it belonged to the future, to people who had not yet been born. That belief placed responsibility on the present. If the dream was to survive, it had to be carried, defended, and expanded, not repeated as words, but lived as choices. He challenged individuals to examine their own role. Not everyone causes injustice, but everyone decides whether it continues. Small acts of courage matter. Speaking truth in private spaces matters. Teaching values to the next generation matters. Change is sustained not by moments of passion, but by habits of conscience. He showed that standing up does not always require confrontation. Sometimes it requires consistency. Sometimes it requires refusing to benefit from unfair systems. Sometimes it requires listening, learning, and unlearning. Courage is not always loud, but it is always intentional. His life warns against comfort without conscience. When people become more invested in peace than injustice, injustice thrives quietly. He reminded the world that real peace is not the absence of tension, but the presence of fairness. Without fairness, calm is just suppression. This is the 8th lesson his life offers. The future does not happen by accident. It is shaped by choices made in the present. Each generation must decide whether it will stand up, believe deeply, and carry the dream forward, or allow it to fade through neglect. The dream is not fragile, but it is demanding. It asks for courage, consistency, and conviction. And now, as always, the responsibility has quietly